The November rain hammered against the Gothic windows of Ravencrest Academy, with the persistence of fingers tapping against glass. It was Tuesday, November 15th, 1977, and the storm that had been brewing over the remote Yorkshire moors for 3 days showed no signs of relenting. The ancient boarding school sat like a fortress against the elements, its Victorian towers disappearing into the low-hanging clouds that seemed to swallow the world beyond its iron gates. Inside the dimly lit corridors, the sound of rainfall mixed with the distant echo of footsteps on marble floors. The Academy, founded in 1847, housed daughters of Britain's elite politicians, industrialists, and nobility who valued tradition above all else. Its reputation for academic excellence was matched only by its strict adherence to discipline and order. Every girl knew her place, every rule was absolute, and deviation was not tolerated. But on this particular night, 5 girls would shatter that order forever. Evangeline Worthington adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses as she peered through the rain-streaked window of the second-floor dormitory. At 17, she was the youngest daughter of a prominent Conservative MP, sent to Ravencrest to learn the refined manners expected of her social class. Her auburn hair was pulled back in the regulation style, but her green eyes held a rebellious spark that no amount of boarding school discipline could extinguish. "The storm's getting worse," she whispered to her roommate, Cordelia Blackwood, who lay reading on her narrow bed. Cordelia, 16, was the daughter of a Scottish lord, whose family had sent children to Ravencrest for 4 generations. Unlike Evangeline's fiery nature, Cordelia possessed an ethereal quality: pale skin, silver blonde hair, and violet eyes that seemed to see things others missed. "Mother Nature's having quite the tantrum," Cordelia replied without looking up from her leather-bound volume of Edgar Allan Poe. "Rather fitting for this place, don't you think?" 3 doors down the corridor, in another dormitory room, Isadora Fenwick was brushing her raven-black hair with methodical strokes. The daughter of a wealthy industrialist from Manchester, Isadora carried herself with the poise of someone born into privilege but had never quite fit the mold her parents had crafted for her. At 17, she was strikingly beautiful, but possessed an intelligence that made some of the staff uncomfortable. She often asked questions that had no easy answers. Her roommate, Persephone Dalton, sat cross-legged on her bed, sketching in a journal with charcoal pencils. Persephone was an artist, the daughter of a renowned gallery owner in London. Her wild curls and paint-stained fingers marked her as different from the other girls, but her gentle nature and creative soul had earned her a circle of devoted friends. At 16, she saw the world through an artist's eyes, finding beauty in shadows and meaning in silence. The 5th girl, Tabitha Roswell, occupied a single room at the end of the corridor, a privilege afforded to her due to her father's substantial donations to the Academy. The daughter of a shipping magnate, Tabitha was perhaps the most enigmatic of the group. At 17, she was beautiful in a classical sense, with chestnut hair and hazel eyes, but there was something guarded about her, as if she carried secrets too heavy for her young shoulders. These 5 girls, despite their different backgrounds and personalities, had formed an unlikely friendship over their 3 years at Ravencrest. They called themselves the Circle, a name that began as a joke about their habit of sitting in a circle during their clandestine midnight gatherings, but had evolved into something more meaningful. They shared secrets, dreams, and a growing dissatisfaction with the rigid expectations placed upon them. As the clock in the main hall chimed 11 times, the corridors of Ravencrest Academy settled into their nightly quiet. Matron Weatherby made her final rounds, her heavy footsteps echoing through the halls, as she ensured every girl was in her proper place. The gas lamps were dimmed to their lowest setting, casting dancing shadows on the paneled walls adorned with portraits of former headmistresses, whose stern gazes seemed to watch over the sleeping students. But sleep would not come easily this night. At precisely 11:47 p.m., Evangeline slipped from her bed, careful not to wake Cordelia, though she suspected her roommate was already aware of her movements. They had done this dance many times before. The circle had been meeting in secret for over a year, gathering in the abandoned tower that had been sealed off since a fire in 1923. It was their sanctuary, their escape from the suffocating expectations of their daytime lives. One by one, the girls made their way through the darkened corridors, avoiding the creaking floorboards they had memorized through months of practice. Isadora moved like a shadow, her dark hair blending with the darkness. Persephone clutched her journal to her chest, her artistic eye automatically noting how the dim lamplight created interesting patterns on the walls. Tabitha emerged last from her room, locking her door with a key she had somehow acquired, just one of many mysteries that surrounded the shipping heiress. They converged at the base of the tower stairs, a narrow spiral staircase that wound upward into darkness. The door to the tower had been locked for decades, but Tabitha had discovered that one of the ancient keys in the school's collection fit the lock perfectly. How she had gained access to test dozens of keys without being caught was a question the others had stopped asking. "The storm is perfect," Isadora whispered as they began their ascent. "No one will hear us with all this rain and wind." The tower room they had claimed as their own was circular, with tall arched windows that on clear nights offered a spectacular view of the Yorkshire countryside. Tonight, those windows were sheets of black glass, rain streaming down like tears. They had furnished their secret space with cushions and blankets, borrowed from various parts of the academy, creating a cozy refuge that felt worlds away from the strict dormitories below. Cordelia lit a single candle. They dared not use more for fear of being discovered, and the 5 girls settled into their familiar circle on the worn wooden floor. The candlelight danced across their young faces, highlighting the determination in their eyes and the sense of anticipation that crackled between them like electricity. "Tonight feels different," Persephone said softly, her artist's intuition picking up on the subtle tension that seemed to permeate the air. "There's something—" She struggled for the words, then simply shook her head and opened her journal to a fresh page. Tabitha reached into a small leather satchel she had brought with her and withdrew a folded piece of paper. The others watched with interest. Tabitha rarely shared anything about her personal life, and any glimpse into her private world was precious. "I received a letter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "from someone who claims to know the truth about my mother's death." The silence that followed was profound. They all knew that Tabitha's mother had died when she was 12, but the circumstances had always been kept vague. Official reports had called it an accident, but Tabitha had never believed that story. Evangeline leaned forward, her political instincts sharpened by years of listening to her father's dinner conversations about power and secrets. "What kind of truth?" Tabitha unfolded the letter with trembling hands. The paper was expensive, cream-colored with a watermark that was barely visible in the candlelight. The handwriting was elegant but urgent, written in deep blue ink that seemed to shimmer in the flickering light. "It says that my mother discovered something about the academy," Tabitha read, her voice growing stronger. "Something that certain people were willing to kill to keep secret." Isadora's analytical mind immediately began working through the implications. Who sent it, and why now? After 5 years. "It's signed only with the initial R," Tabitha replied. "But there's more. The letter says that the evidence is hidden somewhere in the academy itself, in a place where shadows keep their darkest secrets." Cordelia, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke. "The old headmistress' office, in the basement of the main building. It's been sealed since Headmistress Ravencroft died in 1963. But I have heard the older staff whisper about it." The others turned to look at her with surprise. Cordelia had an uncanny ability to know things about the academy that she shouldn't, almost as if she could sense the building's history in its very walls. "How do you know about that?" Evangeline asked. Cordelia's violet eyes reflected the candlelight as she spoke. "I have been having dreams about this place, dreams that feel more like memories. I see things that happened long before we were born, and lately the dreams have been getting stronger, more vivid. I think something is calling to us, something that wants the truth to be revealed." Persephone had been sketching while they talked, her charcoal moving across the paper in quick, sure strokes. When she looked up, her expression was troubled. "I have been drawing the same image over and over without realizing it," she said, turning her journal toward the others. The drawing showed 5 figures standing in a circle, but their faces were obscured by shadows. Above them, a dark presence loomed, and at the bottom of the page, Persephone had unconsciously drawn what looked like a key, ornate and old, with symbols that none of them recognized. "That's impossible," Isadora said, studying the drawing with scientific precision. "You couldn't have known about Tabitha's letter until tonight." Tabitha reached into her satchel again and withdrew something that made them all gasp. It was a key, identical to the one in Persephone's drawing down to the smallest detail. "The letter came with this," she said, placing it in the center of their circle. "The sender claims it opens the door to the truth." The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if responding to the revelation. Lightning flickered through the windows, casting strange shadows that danced around the room like living things. In that moment, each girl felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather, a sense that they were standing at the threshold of something that would change their lives forever. Evangeline, ever the leader, was the first to break the spell. "We have to try it. Tonight." "Are you mad?" Isadora protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "If we are caught in the basement after midnight, we will be expelled for certain." "And if we don't try," Tabitha countered, "I may never learn the truth about my mother's death. And if there really is something dark in this academy's past, don't we have a responsibility to expose it?" Cordelia closed her eyes, as if listening to something only she could hear. When she opened them again, her expression was grave. "The dreams I have been having, they are not just about the past. They are warning. Something terrible happened in that office, something that left an imprint on this place. If we don't face it, it will continue to poison everything here." Persephone looked down at her drawing again, and as she watched, her hand moved of its own accord, adding new details to the image. Dark stains appeared on the floor around the 5 figures, and in the background she drew what looked like files scattered and torn, as if someone had been searching desperately for something. "My hands are moving without my permission," she whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "It's like something is using me to communicate." The rational part of their minds screamed that they should abandon this dangerous path, return to their beds, and pretend the letter had never arrived. But something stronger than logic compelled them forward, a combination of curiosity, loyalty to each other, and a growing sense that they were meant to be here, meant to uncover whatever truth lay buried in the depths of Ravencrest Academy. As they prepared to leave their sanctuary in the tower, none of them could have imagined that this would be the last time the 5 friends would be together in this room. The last time they would sit in their circle sharing secrets and dreams. The last time they would be simply 5 teenage girls, unburdened by the weight of terrible knowledge. The descent from the tower felt different than their usual midnight adventures. Each step seemed to echo with finality, and the shadows in the corridors appeared to shift and writhe as they passed. The storm continued its assault on the ancient building, but now the sound seemed less like rain and more like whispers, urgent, desperate whispers calling them toward their destiny. They moved through the academy with practiced stealth, but tonight their usual routes felt somehow foreign, as if the building itself had changed around them. Hallways seemed longer, doorways darker, and the portraits on the walls appeared to follow their movement with disapproving eyes. The entrance to the basement was located behind the main staircase, concealed by a door that most students assumed led to a supply closet. Tabitha produced a second key from her satchel, one that had come with the mysterious letter, and the lock turned with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for their arrival. The basement of Ravencrest Academy was a labyrinth of storage rooms, unused classrooms, and forgotten spaces that had accumulated decades of discarded furniture and memories. The air was thick with dust and the musty scent of old paper and wood, Their single candle cast a weak pool of light that seemed to be swallowed by the encompassing darkness. They made their way through narrow corridors, lined with wooden crates and filing cabinets. Following Cordelia's unerring sense of direction, she moved as if guided by an invisible hand, turning left and right with confidence despite never having been in this part of the building before. "Here," she said finally, stopping before a heavy oak door that bore a small brass nameplate, E. Ravencroft, Headmistress. Tabitha stepped forward with the ornate key, her hand trembling as she inserted it into the lock. The mechanism turned with a sound like a sigh, and the door swung open to reveal the sealed office of the Academy's former headmistress. The room was a time capsule, preserved exactly as it had been on the day of Eliza Ravencroft's sudden death, 14 years earlier. A massive desk dominated the space, its surface still bearing the impression of papers and books that had long since been removed. Tall bookcases lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes whose titles were barely visible in the candlelight. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the weight of secrets that had been locked away for too long. But it was what they found scattered on the floor that made them all freeze in horror. Files. Dozens of manila folders, their contents spilled across the carpet in a pattern that exactly matched Persephone's unconscious drawing. The files bore the names of former students, and as they knelt to examine them, a terrible pattern began to emerge. "These are all girls who died while attending the academy," Isadora whispered, her analytical mind working despite her growing fear. "Look at the dates, 1949. Evangeline picked up one of the files and read aloud. Victoria Ashworth, age 16, cause of death, accidental drowning in the lake. But listen to this. She flipped through the pages, finding a handwritten note clipped to the back, inconsistent with physical evidence. Bruising on throat suggests. She stopped reading as the implications sank in. These weren't accidents, they were murders, and someone had been documenting the truth, keeping records that contradicted the official reports. Tabitha had found her mother's file, and her face had gone deathly pale as she read. "My mother wasn't just a lamnana," she said, her voice hollow. She was investigating these deaths. She had discovered a pattern, a connection between all these girls. "What connection?" Cordelia asked, though something in her expression suggested she already knew the answer. Tabitha held up a photograph from her mother's file. It showed 5 young women standing together in the academy's garden, their faces bright with youth and promise. Written on the back in her mother's handwriting were the words, "The Circle of Truth." They knew too much. The photograph was dated 1954. And all 5 girls in the image were among the files scattered on the floor. All 5 had died within the same academic year, their deaths officially ruled as accidents, but documented in these secret files as something far more sinister. As they absorbed this revelation, Persephone's hand began moving again, sketching frantically in her journal. This time she drew the basement room they were standing in, but with additional figures, shadowy forms moving through the darkness. And in the center, a symbol that made them all step back in fear. It was the Academy's crest, but corrupted, twisted into something malevolent. Around it were words that seemed to writhe and shift even as she drew them. "The circle must not be broken. We need to leave," Evangeline said, her political instincts suddenly screaming danger. "We need to leave now and take these files with us. This is evidence." Her words were cut short by a sound that froze their blood. Footsteps in the corridor outside, deliberate and unhurried, as if someone had been waiting for them to discover what they had just found. The girls looked at each other with growing terror, realizing that their midnight adventure had become something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. The files scattered around them told a story of decades of murder and cover-up, and they had just become the latest chapter in that dark tale. As the footsteps grew closer, Tabitha grabbed as many files as she could carry, stuffing them into her satchel along with her mother's research. The others followed suit, their movements quick and desperate as they tried to gather evidence of the conspiracy they had uncovered. But even as they prepared to flee, each girl felt a terrible certainty settling over them like a shroud. They had learned too much, seen too much, and whoever was responsible for the deaths of all those other girls would not let them leave Ravencrest Academy alive. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and in the silence that followed, they could hear the sound of keys jingling, as if someone was selecting the right one to lock them inside forever. The candle flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness just as the door began to creak shut. The darkness in Headmistress Ravencroft's sealed office was absolute, a suffocating blackness that seemed to press against their skin like cold velvet. The 5 girls huddled together in the center of the room, their breathing shallow and quick as they listened to the deliberate footsteps that had stopped just beyond the door. For a moment that stretched like eternity, there was only silence broken by the distant rumble of thunder and the sound of their own rapid heartbeats. Then, with a soft click that might as well have been a gunshot in the stillness, they heard the door lock from the outside. "No," Evangeline whispered, her voice barely audible. She fumbled through the darkness toward where she remembered the door being, her hands sliding along the cold stone wall until they found the heavy oak panels. She pressed her ear against the wood, listening for any sound of movement in the corridor beyond, but heard only the echo of retreating footsteps. Tabitha's satchel rustled as she clutched it tighter, the stolen files pressing against her ribs like evidence of their doom. "Whoever that was," she said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins, "they wanted us to find this room. The letter, the key, it was all a trap." Isadora's analytical mind was working frantically, trying to piece together the implications of their situation. But why? If they wanted us dead, there would have been easier ways. Why go through this elaborate charade? Cordelia had moved to one of the tall windows, her pale hands pressed against the glass as she stared out into the storm-lashed courtyard. "Because they needed to look like an accident," she said softly. "Just like all the others. 5 girls trapped in a sealed room during a storm, overcome by, what? Carbon monoxide? A gas leak? Something that would explain why we never made it back to our dormitories." Persephone had been quiet since the candle died, but now she spoke from somewhere in the darkness near the desk. "I can see them," she whispered, and there was something in her voice that made the others turn toward her, despite the impenetrable blackness. "The girls from the files, they are standing all around us, and they are trying to tell us something." "Persephone," Evangeline said gently, recognizing the edge of hysteria in her friend's voice. "There's no one here but us. The darkness is playing tricks." "No," Persephone's voice rose sharply, then dropped to an urgent whisper. "Listen to me. Ever since we entered this room, I have been seeing things, feeling things. This place is saturated with death, with the echoes of what happened here, and they are showing me, oh God, they are showing me how we die." The silence that followed was broken only by Isadora's sharp intake of breath. "What do you see?" she asked, her scientific skepticism warring with the growing dread in her stomach. Persephone's voice, when it came again, was hollow, distant, as if she was speaking from a great depth. "We don't suffocate. We don't die from gas or anything like that. Someone comes back. Someone who's been watching us all along. Someone who knows about the circle and what we have discovered. They come back with others, and they—" Her voice broke off abruptly, and they heard the sound of her journal hitting the floor. "They what?" Tabitha pressed, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "They make it look like we ran away," Persephone finished in a rush. "They stage our disappearance, make it seem like we fled the academy in the night. Our bodies are never found because they are never meant to be found. We simply... and everyone believes we were just rebellious girls who couldn't handle the pressure of our expectations." The weight of this revelation settled over them like a burial shroud. It was a perfect crime, one that had apparently been perfected over decades of practice. Who would question the disappearance of 5 troublesome students on a stormy night? Their families would be devastated, but would eventually accept that their daughters had chosen to abandon their privileged lives for unknown adventures. Evangeline's political mind immediately grasped the elegance of such a scheme. Our families would search, but where would they look? We'd become a mystery, a cautionary tale told to future students about the dangers of breaking rules. But why? Isadora asked again, her need for logic and reason refusing to be satisfied. What possible motive could there be for killing schoolgirls over the course of decades? It was Cordelia who answered, her voice carrying an otherworldly certainty that chilled them all. We are not the first circle. There have been others, groups of girls who became too close, who asked too many questions, who threatened to expose something that powerful people need to keep hidden. She turned from the window, though they couldn't see her in the darkness. I have been having the dreams for months, but I thought they were just nightmares. Now I understand they were memory. This academy, this beautiful, prestigious institution that our families pay fortunes to attend, it's built on a foundation of murder and conspiracy. Tabitha's grip on her satchel tightened. My mother found out. That's why she died. She discovered the pattern and tried to expose it, but they killed her and made it look like an accident. And now, somehow, someone wants us to follow in her footsteps. Or, Evangeline said slowly, a new thought occurring to her. Someone wants us to succeed where she failed. Think about it. If they wanted us dead, we'd already be dead. The letter, the key, even being locked in this room. What if it's not a trap but a test? Before anyone could respond to this possibility, they heard a new sound that made their blood freeze. The soft scraping of stone against stone, coming from somewhere within the room itself. It was followed by a current of cold, fresh air that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. There's a hidden passage, Isadora breathed, her scientific mind immediately focusing on this new development. The sound, the air movement. There's another way out of this room. They began feeling their way through the darkness, hands extended, bumping into furniture and each other as they searched for the source of the air current. It was Persephone who found it, her artist's sensitivity to spatial relationships guiding her to a section of bookshelf that had swung inward on hidden hinges. Here, she called softly, and the others converged on her location. The opening revealed a narrow passage that disappeared into darkness, but the air flowing through it carried the scent of rain and earth, the smell of the outside world. A tunnel, Tabitha said, feeling along the rough stone walls of the passage. It must lead outside the academy grounds. Cordelia was the first to voice what they were all thinking. This is how she did it. How the person who's been helping us planned for us to escape. They knew we'd be trapped, and they prepared a way out. As they prepared to enter the passage, carrying only what they could manage in the darkness, each girl felt the weight of the decision they were making. Once they entered that tunnel, there would be no going back to their old lives. They would become exactly what their eventual disappearance would claim they were: runaways, outcasts from the privileged world that had shaped them. But they would be alive. The tunnel was narrow and damp, carved from the same Yorkshire stone as the academy's foundations. They moved in single file, feeling their way along the walls, their progress slow and uncertain. The passage sloped downward, leading them deeper underground before beginning to rise again. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, and their feet splashed through shallow puddles that reflected no light in the absolute darkness. Behind them, they could hear sounds from the academy doors slamming, voices calling, the organized chaos of a search beginning. Their absence had been discovered, and soon the entire staff would be looking for 5 missing students. How long do we have before they find the office? Evangeline asked, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Not long, Tabitha replied. Matron Weatherby does a bed check at 2 a.m. if there's been any disturbance. When she finds our beds empty, she will raise the alarm, Isadora finished. And if someone comes to check on us in that sealed room and finds it empty with a hidden passage exposed. They picked up their pace, driven by the knowledge that every minute brought their pursuers closer to discovering their escape route. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, winding through the foundations of the academy and beyond, beneath the grounds they had walked every day for 3 years. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably less than 30 minutes, they saw it, a faint grey rectangle ahead of them that could only be the exit. They emerged into a small stone chamber that appeared to be some kind of maintenance shed or groundskeeper's shelter. Through a grimy window, they could see the storm still raging across the Yorkshire moors, but the intensity had diminished somewhat. Persephone immediately began sketching again, her hands moving across the page even in the dim light filtering through the window. "I need to document everything," she said when the others looked at her with concern. "Every detail, every clue. If we are going to expose this conspiracy, we need evidence beyond just the files." "Where are we?" Isidore asked, peering out at the unfamiliar landscape. The academy's lights were visible in the distance, but they appeared to be at least a mile away, hidden in a depression between 2 hills. Cordelia had found an old oil lamp and matches on a shelf near the door. As she lit it, warm yellow light filled the chamber, revealing stone walls covered with what appeared to be decades of carved initials and dates. But these weren't the idle scratches of bored groundskeepers. They were records, carefully carved lists of names and dates that made the girl's blood run cold. "Look at this," Cordelia whispered, running her fingers over the carved stone. "These are all the girls from the files, and more. Dozens of names going back to the 1890s. This place, it's not just a maintenance shed, it's a monument to their victims." Evangeline examined the carvings more closely, her political instincts recognizing the significance of what they had found. This is evidence, proof that someone has been keeping track of every murder for over 80 years. But who and why? The answer came from an unexpected source. As Tabitha opened her satchel to check on the stolen files, she found something that hadn't been there before, a leather journal, old and worn, with the initials ER embossed on the cover. "Eliza Ravencroft," she breathed, recognizing the name of the headmistress whose office they had broken into. But how? She opened the journal, and her mother's handwriting stared back at her from the yellowed pages. But these weren't her mother's words. They were copies, transcriptions of entries from Ravencroft's original journal, documenting her growing horror as she discovered the truth about her own institution. Reading by lamplight, Tabitha shared the most damning entries with the others. March 15th, 1962. "I can no longer deny what I have suspected for months. The Board of Governors is not what it appears to be. These are not concerned parents and educators. They are something else entirely, something that views our students as expendable resources in some larger game I cannot yet comprehend." April 3rd, 1962. "I have found evidence of the previous incidents. What I thought were isolated tragedies were in fact systematic eliminations. The circle appears every few years. Groups of intelligent, questioning girls who form bonds that threaten whatever secret this institution serves to protect." May 20th, 1962. "I know they suspect my investigation. Lord Pemberton visited today with thinly veiled threats about the importance of institutional loyalty and the unfortunate accidents that befall those who misunderstand their place in the natural order. I must hide this journal and the evidence I have gathered. If something happens to me, I pray someone will continue the work." June 14th, 1962. "They have made their intentions clear. I am to cease my investigation immediately or suffer the consequences. I have prepared contingencies, hidden passages, and safe houses that future investigators might use. The truth must survive, even if I do not." The final entry was dated just days before Ravencroft's sudden death, and it included detailed drawings of the hidden tunnel system, safe locations beyond the academy grounds, and most importantly, a list of names members of the Board of Governors who were part of the conspiracy. As they studied the journal, the full scope of what they had stumbled into became clear. Ravencrest Academy was not just a school but a front for something much more sinister. The Board of Governors, composed of some of Britain's most powerful families, used the institution to monitor and eliminate potential threats, young women who might grow up to expose their crimes or challenge their authority. "We are not just dealing with a few murders," Evangeline said, her voice grim with understanding. "This is a systematic program of social control that's been operating for almost a century. They identify girls who pose a potential threat to the established order and eliminate them before they can become dangerous." Isadora's analytical mind was working through the implications. But what kind of threat could schoolgirls possibly pose? What could we know that would be worth killing for? The answer came from an unexpected source, Persephone's latest sketch. As they watched, her hand moved across the page, drawing not the stone chamber they were in, but a grand room filled with robed figures standing around a pentagram carved into the floor. In the center of the symbol lay what appeared to be a young girl, and around the edges were symbols that none of them recognized, but all of them instinctively feared. "Ritual," Cordelia said, her voice hollow with understanding. "It's not just about eliminating threats. They are using us for something else, something that requires specific types of victims. Young women from powerful families, bound together by friendship and trust." The realization hit them all at the same time. They hadn't been chosen randomly, and their friendship wasn't the coincidence they had thought it was. They had been selected, cultivated, and manipulated into forming the exact type of bond that their enemies required for whatever dark purpose they served. "We need to leave," Tabitha said urgently, closing the journal and stuffing it back into her satchel. "If they realize we have found this place, that we have both the files and Ravencroft's journal." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood that their situation had evolved far beyond a simple matter of uncovering a conspiracy. They were now in possession of evidence that could bring down some of the most powerful people in Britain, and those people had already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their secrets. As they prepared to leave the stone chamber, each carrying what evidence they could manage, they heard a sound that made their hearts stop, the distant howling of dogs. Bloodhounds, trained to track human scent, and they were getting closer. "They have brought hunters," Cordelia said, her otherworldly perception picking up more than just the sound of approaching hounds. "Professional trackers, not just academy staff. They are not taking any chances this time." The storm outside had weakened to a steady rain, which would make tracking easier for their pursuers. They had perhaps 15 minutes before the dogs reached their location, and nowhere to run on the open moors without being seen. But as they stood in the lamplight, surrounded by the carved names of decades of victims, Evangeline made a decision that would change everything. "We don't run," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone born to leadership. "We fight. We have the evidence. We know the truth. And we have each other. If we are going to die tonight, let's make sure our deaths accomplish something their murders never could." Tabitha opened the journal again, studying Ravencroft's carefully drawn maps of the tunnel system. "There's another passage," she said, pointing to a section that led not away from the academy but directly beneath it. "It connects to the old chapel in the main building. If we can get there, we can broadcast the truth," Isadora finished, understanding immediately. "The academy has a radio system for emergency communications. If we can reach it, we can transmit everything we have learned to the outside world." The howling was getting closer now, and they could hear human voices joining the chorus of the hunt. Their pursuers were coordinating, closing the net around their location with professional efficiency. As they entered the second tunnel, deeper and more treacherous than the first, each girl carried with her the weight of terrible knowledge and the slim hope that they might yet turn their impending deaths into something meaningful. Behind them, the carved names of their predecessors seemed to whisper encouragement, the voices of the dead urging them forward toward a confrontation that had been building for nearly a century. The tunnel to the chapel was older than the escape route they had used, carved from living rock and reinforced with timbers that had long since begun to rot. Water seeped through the walls, creating slick surfaces that made their progress treacherous. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that every step brought them closer to either salvation or a final reckoning with the forces that had claimed so many lives before theirs. As they climbed toward the chapel, guided by Ravencroft's detailed maps, they began to hear a new sound that chilled them more than the howling of the hounds. The low, rhythmic chanting of human voices, coming from somewhere above them, in the academy itself. The ritual had begun, and they were running out of time. The chanting grew louder as they climbed, the ancient stone steps slick with moisture and decades of accumulated moss. Each footfall echoed in the narrow confines of the tunnel, a percussion that seemed to match the rhythm of the voices above. The sound was hypnotic, terrifying in its organized cadence, and it spoke of something far older and more terrible than anything they had imagined. Persephone had stopped sketching, her artist's hands too unsteady to hold the charcoal. But her eyes had taken on a glassy quality, as if she was seeing beyond the physical world around them. "They are not just chanting," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the echo of their movement. "They are calling something. Something that's been sleeping under this place for a very long time." Cordelia, who had been leading them through the tunnel using her uncanny sense of direction, suddenly stopped. Her pale face turned back toward the others, and in the dim light of their single lamp, her expression was one of absolute terror. "We are too late," she said, and her voice carried a finality that made their blood freeze. "Whatever they needed us for, they have found another way. The chanting, it's not a summoning anymore. It's a binding. They are sealing something away, something they awakened when we escaped." Tabitha clutched her satchel tighter, the stolen evidence pressing against her ribs like a physical weight. "What are you talking about? You are not making sense." But Evangeline understood, her political instincts recognizing the implications of what Cordelia was suggesting. "They never intended to capture us tonight. Our escape was planned, expected. We are not the sacrifice, we are the catalyst. Our discovery of the truth, our flight through these tunnels has triggered something they have been preparing for." The howling of the hounds had grown closer, but now it was joined by something else. A deep, thrumming vibration that seemed to come from the very foundations of the academy. The walls of the tunnel began to shake, and dust rained down from the ceiling, as whatever lay beneath Ravencrest Academy began to stir. "The chapel," Isadora said urgently, her scientific mind focusing on their immediate goal, despite the growing supernatural dread. "We still need to reach the radio. Whatever's happening, the world needs to know." They pressed on, but their progress was hampered by the increasing instability of the tunnel. Stones loosened by the vibrations crashed down behind them, and more than once they had to help each other over newly formed obstacles. The lamp flickered dangerously, threatening to plunge them into complete darkness just when they needed light most desperately. Behind them, the sound of pursuit had changed. The dogs were no longer howling. They were whimpering, their animal instincts recoiling from whatever force was awakening in the depths below. But the human voices had multiplied, and now they could hear the measured tread of many feet moving through the tunnels they had already traversed. "They are sealing the passages behind us," Tabitha realized, hearing the distinct sound of heavy stones being moved into place. "They are herding us toward the chapel, making sure we have only one way to go." "It's still a trap," Cordelia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Even if we reach the radio, even if we manage to transmit our evidence, they will never let us leave that chapel alive." Persephone had begun sketching again, her hand moving frantically across the page as visions flashed through her mind. "The chapel isn't what we think it is," she said, her voice distant and strange. "It's not consecrated ground. It's the opposite. A place where sacred has been inverted into profane. The radio equipment isn't for emergency communications. It's for something else entirely." She held up her latest drawing, and the others gasped. The sketch showed the academy chapel, but transformed. The Christian symbols had been replaced with others, ancient and terrible, carved into every surface. The altar was not for worship, but for sacrifice, and surrounding it were robed figures whose faces were hidden in shadow. At the center of it all was a communication device, but not the kind they had expected. This was something that spoke not to the outside world, but to dimensions beyond human understanding. "We can't go there," Evangeline said, her leadership instinct screaming danger. "If what you are seeing is true, we will be walking directly into their hands." But even as she spoke, the tunnel began to collapse behind them. Their pursuers weren't just sealing passages, they were bringing down entire sections, forcing the girls forward with no possibility of retreat. The choice had been taken from them, just as every choice in their lives had been carefully orchestrated by forces they were only beginning to understand. The final ascent to the chapel was the most treacherous yet. The ancient steps were crumbling under the supernatural pressure building beneath the academy, and more than once they had to catch each other as the stone gave way. The chanting above had reached a crescendo, and with it came a smell that made them gag, the scent of something long dead and better left buried. When they finally reached the hidden entrance to the chapel, Tabitha was the first to peer through the concealed opening. What she saw made her stumble backward in horror. The chapel had indeed been transformed, just as Persephone's vision had shown. The beautiful stained glass windows depicted not scenes from Christian mythology, but symbols of power and domination that hurt to look at directly. The wooden pews had been arranged in a perfect circle around an altar that was stained with substances that could not have been wine. And surrounding it all were dozens of figures in dark robes, their faces hidden but their intentions unmistakably malevolent. At the center of the altar was not a cross, but a device that seemed to pulse with its own dark energy. It was clearly some form of communication equipment, but its purpose was not to reach the human world. The antenna pointed not skyward but downward, into the depths beneath the academy, and the signals it transmitted carried words in languages that predated human civilization. "They have been using it to maintain control," Isadora whispered, her scientific mind recoiling from the implications. "Not just over the academy, but over the entire region. That's how they have kept their conspiracy hidden for so long. They have been broadcasting compliance, making people forget what they have seen, covering up their crimes with supernatural influence." The robed figures had begun to move in their ritualistic circle, and as they did, the girls could see that they were not all adults. Some were clearly students, young women who had been indoctrinated into whatever cult had taken root in the heart of the academy. Their movements were synchronized, hypnotic, and utterly devoid of individual will. "How many generations of students have they corrupted?" Cordelia asked, and her voice carried a depth of sadness that seemed to encompass decades of lost potential. "How many bright young minds have they twisted to serve their purposes?" But it was Persephone who made the most chilling observation. "Look at the altar," she said, pointing through the opening. "Look at what they have placed on it." There, arranged in a perfect pentagram around the communication device, were 5 sets of academy uniforms, empty uniforms, laid out as if waiting for their occupants. The message was clear. The ritual required their participation, whether willing or not, and their physical presence in those robes was the final component needed to complete whatever working they had been building toward for decades. "We are not just witnesses," Evangeline realized, her political instincts finally grasping the full scope of the trap they had walked into. "We are participants. Everything we have done tonight, every choice we have made, has been choreographed to bring us to this moment. Our rebellion, our investigation, even our escape, it's all been part of their ritual." The vibrations from below had grown so intense that pieces of the chapel ceiling were beginning to fall. Whatever lay beneath the academy was close to breaking free, and their presence was the key to either binding it permanently or setting it loose upon the world. Tabitha opened Ravencroft's journal one final time, scanning the pages for any clue about how to break the cycle. What she found made her blood run cold. "Listen to this," she said, reading from the final entry. "The entity beneath the academy feeds on the despair of the innocent. Each generation of victims strengthens its bonds to our world, but also increases its hunger. The circle is not chosen randomly. They are selected for their potential to resist, because resistance makes the eventual submission more powerful. When they finally accept their fate, when hope dies completely, the entity gains enough strength to influence the world beyond these grounds. She looked up at her friends, seeing her own terror reflected in their faces. We are not just being sacrificed, we are being broken, systematically destroyed, until we willingly participate in our own destruction. That's what gives it power, not our death, but our choice to embrace it. The sound of footsteps in the tunnel behind them had grown closer, and now they could hear voices, not the chanting from the chapel, but the urgent whispers of their pursuers. They had perhaps minutes before they were discovered, and their options had dwindled to nothing. The uniforms, Cordelia said suddenly, her otherworldly perception focusing on a detail the others had missed. Look at them more carefully. They are not just empty. They are prepared, consecrated, blessed, made ready for specific occupants. But what if we don't put them on? What if we refuse to play their game even at the cost of our lives? Persephone's hand was moving again, sketching frantically in the dying light of their lamp. This time her drawing showed the 5 of them, but not as victims. They stood defiantly in the center of the chapel, their school uniforms transformed into armor, their joined hands creating a barrier of light that held back the darkness pressing in from all sides. "We don't have to be victims," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We can be warriors. We can turn their own ritual against them." Isadora's scientific mind immediately began working through the possibilities. If the entity feeds on despair and submission, then defiance might weaken it. If we enter that chapel not as broken victims but as determined opponents, we could disrupt the entire working. Evangeline finished, her leadership instincts recognizing a viable strategy, even in their desperate circumstances, but it would mean certain death. If we fail, if we are not strong enough, then we die as ourselves, Tabitha said, clutching her mother's evidence against her chest. Not as their puppets, not as broken victims, but as young women who chose to fight back against evil. The footsteps behind them had reached the base of the final staircase. Their pursuers would be upon them within moments, and the time for decision had arrived. They could surrender, accept their fate, and become part of the conspiracy that had claimed so many lives, or they could make a stand, knowing that failure meant not just their own deaths, but potentially the release of something that had been contained beneath Ravencrest Academy for generations. As one, they made their choice. The hidden entrance to the chapel swung open on silent hinges, and 5 teenage girls stepped into a nightmare that had been preparing for their arrival since the day they first met. The robed figures turned toward them with expressions of satisfaction and anticipation, clearly expecting to see broken, terrified victims ready to accept their fate. Instead, they saw something that had not appeared in this chapel for over 80 years: defiance. Evangeline stepped forward first, her political training allowing her to project authority even in the face of supernatural terror. "We know what you are," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the resumed chanting. "We know what you have done, and we are here to end it." The effect of her words was immediate and dramatic. The chanting faltered, the robed figures stumbled in their ritualistic movements, and the communication device on the altar began to emit sparks and smoke. For the first time in decades, someone had entered this sacred space not as a victim but as an opponent, and the carefully maintained balance of power began to shift. But their defiance came at a cost. The entity beneath the academy, sensing the disruption of its feeding ritual, began to push more violently against the bonds that held it. The floor of the chapel cracked, revealing glimpses of something vast and terrible moving in the depths below. The stained glass windows exploded inward, showering the assembly with fragments that seemed to whisper as they fell. And in the center of it all, 5 young women joined hands and prepared to face whatever came next, knowing that their courage in this moment would determine not just their own fate, but the fate of every student who would walk these halls in the years to come. The final battle for Ravencrest Academy was about to begin. The moment their hands joined in defiance, reality itself seemed to convulse. The communication device on the altar exploded in a shower of sparks and twisted metal, its otherworldly frequencies severed by the power of their united will. The robed figures stumbled backward, their synchronized movements broken as decades of carefully maintained control began to unravel. But their act of rebellion came at a terrible cost. The entity beneath the academy denied the willing sacrifice that would have strengthened its bonds, began to tear free from the constraints that had held it for nearly a century. The floor of the chapel split with sounds like breaking bones, revealing a chasm that seemed to descend into infinite darkness. From those depths rose a presence so malevolent that the air itself seemed to recoil from its touch. "What have you done?" screamed a voice from beneath one of the robes, and the figure threw back its hood to reveal the face of Headmistress Blackthorn, the woman who had replaced Eliza Ravencroft 14 years earlier. Her elegant features were twisted with rage and terror as she watched her carefully orchestrated ritual collapse into chaos. "Do you have any idea what you have unleashed?" Evangeline squeezed her friend's hands tighter, drawing strength from their connection even as supernatural wind began to howl through the broken chapel. "We know exactly what we have done," she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "We have chosen to fight rather than feed your monster." The other robed figures were removing their hoods now, revealing faces that made the girls' blood run cold. Members of the Board of Governors, prominent politicians, wealthy industrialists. The very people who had sent them to this academy were the architects of its darkest secrets. Among them were faces they recognized from their own families' social circles, people who had attended their birthday parties and family gatherings, all the while planning their eventual sacrifice. Lord Pemberton, Evangeline's father's longtime political ally, stepped forward with an expression of paternal disappointment that was somehow more terrifying than outright hostility. "My dear girls," he said, his cultured voice barely audible over the growing supernatural storm, "you understand so little. This entity, this force you are so eager to condemn, has been the source of Britain's power for generations. Every victory in war, every economic triumph, every moment of imperial glory, it all flows from our covenant with the darkness below." Cordelia's violet eyes blazed with otherworldly fire as she responded, "And every murdered girl, every destroyed life, every family destroyed by your glorious empire that flows from it too. We have seen the true cost of your power, and we reject it." The chasm in the floor was widening, and now they could see movement in its depths, something vast and tentacled, covered in scales that reflected no light, rising toward the surface with prehistoric hunger. The entity was ancient beyond human comprehension, a thing that had been old when the stones of Ravencrest Academy were first laid, bound by rituals that required the willing sacrifice of innocents to maintain their power. Persephone's journal had fallen from her hands, but her artistic vision was clearer than ever. She could see the threads of power that connected this creature to the conspiracy above, lines of influence that stretched across the British Isles and beyond. "It's not just about our deaths," she said, her voice carrying the authority of prophecy. "They have been feeding it for decades, using our life force to fuel a network of control that spans the globe. Every girl who died here became a node in their web of influence." Tabitha opened her mother's satchel and scattered the stolen files across the cracked floor of the chapel. The pages flew in the supernatural wind, carrying with them the documented evidence of decades of murder and conspiracy. But as the papers touched the ground, something unexpected happened. They began to glow with a soft, pure light that seemed to push back against the darkness rising from below. The truth itself has power, Isadora realized, her scientific mind grasping the metaphysical principles at work. Every documented fact, every piece of evidence, every witness statement, it creates its own kind of binding, a chain of reality that even this thing can't completely break. The entity in the chasm let out a sound that was part roar, part scream, and part something else entirely. A noise that spoke of eons of hunger and the fury of a predator denied its prey. Its writhing mass began to push against the barriers that still held it, ancient stones cracking under the pressure of its rage. But the conspirators weren't finished. Headmistress Blackthorn raised her arms, and the remaining robed figures formed a new circle around the girls. "If you won't participate willingly," she snarled, "then you will serve as unwilling conduits. Your defiance only makes the eventual feeding more powerful." The air around the 5 girls began to thicken, pressing against them with supernatural weight. They could feel their strength being drained, their life force being siphoned away to feed the hungry darkness below. But instead of breaking their circle, they drew closer together, their joined hands becoming a conduit for something the conspirators hadn't anticipated. Love, friendship, the unbreakable bonds forged through 3 years of shared secrets and mutual support. The entity had been feeding on isolation, despair, and the breaking of human connections for so long that it had no defense against the opposite force. "Now," Evangeline shouted, and as one, the 5 girls began to recite the names they had memorized from the scattered files. Every victim, every murdered girl, every life that had been sacrificed to feed this abomination. With each name, the light from the documents grew brighter, and the entity's struggles grew more desperate. Victoria Ashworth. They called out together, and somewhere in the supernatural chaos, they felt the presence of a 16-year-old girl who had died in 1949, her spirit finally acknowledged and honored. Catherine Morley. The name of a 15-year-old from 1953 rang through the chapel, and her ghostly form seemed to stand with them, adding her strength to theirs. Elizabeth Fairfax, Margaret Thornton, Helen Crosswhite. Name after name, decade after decade of victims called forth from whatever realm had claimed them, and with each invocation, the bonds holding the entity grew stronger rather than weaker, as if the acknowledgement of its victims was weaving new chains around its thrashing form. The conspirators realized what was happening and began their own counter-chant, words in languages that predated human civilization. But their voices were few, and they were fighting against the accumulated power of decades of injustice finally being brought to light. Lord Pemberton lunged forward, trying to break the circle of girls by force. But as his hands touched Evangeline's shoulder, he screamed and fell back. Her skin was blazing with the same pure light that emanated from the scattered documents, the light of truth made manifest. "You cannot touch us," Cordelia said, and her voice seemed to carry the authority of prophecy itself. "We are protected by every girl who died in this place, every victim whose story was silenced, every truth that was buried in these walls. We are not alone, and we are not afraid." The entity in the chasm was fighting frantically now, its alien intelligence finally understanding that it was not being fed, but bound. The willing sacrifice of the innocent had been the source of its power, but the unwilling defiance of the same innocence was proving to be its prison. Every act of courage, every moment of resistance, every refusal to bow to fear was another bar in its cage. But the battle was far from over. As the creature's thrashing grew more desperate, the academy itself began to collapse. Windows exploded throughout the building, walls cracked and crumbled, and the very foundations shook as the entity threw its full power against the constraints that held it. "The building won't hold," Isadora shouted over the chaos. "If this thing breaks free completely, it won't just destroy the academy, it could devastate the entire region." Persephone, her artistic vision now expanded to encompass realms beyond the physical, saw the solution with crystalline clarity. "We can't just bind it," she said. "We have to send it back. Close the door between its realm and ours permanently." But such an action would require a sacrifice of a different kind. Not their deaths, but their lives, their futures, their dreams, everything they had planned to become. To seal the portal permanently would mean binding themselves to this place forever. becoming guardians rather than victims, protectors rather than casualties. Tabitha looked around at her four best friends, seeing the same understanding in their eyes. They were 17 and 16 years old, with entire lifetimes ahead of them, families who loved them, dreams they wanted to pursue, a world beyond Ravencrest Academy that was calling to them. But they also knew that if they walked away now, if they chose their own futures over the safety of others, the entity would eventually break free and claim countless more victims. Together, Evangeline asked, and in that single word was a lifetime of friendship, trust, and shared purpose. Together, they replied, and their voices carried the weight of absolute certainty. The ritual they performed was not one of sacrifice, but of transformation. Instead of feeding their life force to the entity below, they poured it into the academy itself, into the very stones and timbers that had housed generations of students. They became part of Ravencrest, not as ghosts or victims, but as guardians whose purpose was to ensure that no future student would ever face what they had faced. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The entity's screams of rage turned to howls of frustration as it found itself not just bound but banished, thrust back into whatever dark dimension had spawned it. The chasm in the chapel floor began to close, sealing itself with stones that glowed faintly with the same pure light that had protected the girls. The conspirators tried to flee, but they found their way blocked by figures that seemed to step out of the academy's walls themselves. The spirits of every victim who had ever died in this place, now empowered by the girls' sacrifice to seek their own justice. Lord Pemberton, Headmistress Blackthorne, and the others found themselves surrounded by the ghosts of their victims, and in that moment, they learned what true terror meant. As dawn broke over the Yorkshire moors on November 16, 1977, search teams found Ravencrest Academy standing intact, but forever changed. The 5 girls were nowhere to be found, and despite extensive searches that continued for months, no trace of them was ever discovered. Their beds had not been slept in, their belongings remained undisturbed, and it was as if they had simply vanished into the night. The official investigation concluded that 5 troubled students had run away during the storm, probably meeting with some accident on the dangerous moors. Their families grieved, memorial services were held, and life at the academy continued much as it always had. But there were differences that only the most observant noticed. The suicide rate among students dropped to 0. Reports of abuse or harassment were taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the institution for decades seemed to lift, replaced by something that could only be described as protection. Students began reporting dreams where they received guidance and comfort during difficult times. Young women who might have been targeted by predatory staff or students found themselves inexplicably protected, as if guardian angels were watching over them. The Academy's reputation for academic excellence remained intact, but it became paired with something new, a genuine care for the well-being of its students. The conspirators were found in various states of madness or death over the following months. Lord Pemberton was discovered in his London townhouse, apparently having aged decades overnight, muttering about the girls who wouldn't submit until his death 3 weeks later. Headmistress Blackthorne disappeared entirely, leaving behind only a resignation letter that spoke vaguely of unfinished business and debts that must be paid. The Board of Governors was quietly restructured, its membership changing completely as the old guard either died, disappeared, or suffered various forms of psychological breakdown. The new board consisted of educators and parents whose primary concern was genuinely the welfare of the students, not the perpetuation of ancient conspiracies. 46 years later, present day. Dr. Miranda Fitzgerald, the Academy's new head archivist, discovered the truth purely by accident. While cataloging materials for the Academy's upcoming bicentennial celebration, she found a sealed section of the basement that had been forgotten for decades. Behind a wall that had been bricked up in the 1970s, she uncovered a treasure trove of documents that told the real story of what had happened on that stormy night in November. The files were still there, every piece of evidence that Tabitha had stolen, along with Eliza Ravencroft's journal and dozens of other documents that painted a complete picture of the conspiracy. But most remarkably, she found a collection of letters written in 5 different handwritings, addressed to whoever finds this truth. The letters explained everything: the entity beneath the academy, the generations of ritual murder, the conspiracy that had reached into the highest levels of British society, and the sacrifice that 5 young women had made to end it forever. They provided names, dates, evidence that could still bring justice to the families of victims who had died decades earlier. But perhaps most importantly, they contained a message of hope. The letters spoke of their continuing presence in the academy, their role as protectors and guardians, and their deep satisfaction with how the institution had evolved since their sacrifice. They had not died, they had transformed, becoming something greater than they could have ever been in life. Dr. Fitzgerald faced the same choice that countless others had faced throughout history, when confronted with truths too large and terrible for the world to easily accept. She could publish her findings, expose the conspiracy, and bring justice to the victim, but doing so would also reveal the supernatural elements of the story, the entity that had been bound beneath the academy, and the ongoing presence of the 5 guardians who still watched over their students. In the end, she chose a middle path. She quietly contacted the families of the documented victims, providing them with enough evidence to find closure without revealing the full supernatural truth. She arranged for memorial plaques to be installed throughout the academy, honoring the memory of students who had died in previous decades, giving their names the recognition they had never received in life. And in the Reformed Chapel, now a simple, beautiful space dedicated to meditation and reflection, she placed a special memorial: 5 empty desks arranged in a circle with brass nameplates reading Evangeline Worthington, Cordelia Blackwood, Isadora Fenwick, Persephone Dalton, and Tabitha Roswell. The plaque beneath read simply, "In memory of 5 young women who chose courage over fear, truth over silence, and love over hatred." They remind us that the greatest power is not in what we can take, but in what we are willing to give. Current students often report feeling a sense of peace and safety when they sit at those desks, as if invisible hands are guiding their studies and invisible voices are whispering encouragement during difficult times. The memorial has become a place of pilgrimage for students facing challenges, and many have left notes of thanks for guidance received and protection felt. Dr. Fitzgerald kept the original documents in a secure archive, along with a complete record of her investigation and the evidence she had uncovered. She made arrangements for the truth to be preserved, so that future generations would understand the price that had been paid for their safety and the debt of gratitude they owed to 5 young women who had chosen to become legends rather than victims. On quiet nights, when the Yorkshire wind whistles through the academy's ancient corridors, staff and students sometimes catch glimpses of 5 young women walking the halls together, their faces bright with eternal youth and purpose. They are no longer the frightened schoolgirls who stumbled upon a conspiracy in 1977. They are the guardians of Ravencrest Academy, protectors who ensure that the darkness which once flourished in these halls can never return. The mystery of their disappearance remains officially unsolved. Filed away in police archives as another cold case that will likely never be resolved. But the truth lives on in the walls of the academy they saved, in the lives of students they continue to protect, and in the legacy of courage they left behind. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved by the world at large. Some truths are too precious to be exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny. And sometimes the greatest victory is not in being remembered for what you did, but in ensuring that others never have to face what you faced. The 5 girls of Ravencrest Academy found their immortality not in fame or recognition, but in love, the love that bound them together in life, the love that gave them strength to face impossible odds, and the love that continues to protect and guide those who walk the halls they once called home. In the end, they had not vanished at all. They had simply become something more beautiful and powerful than death could ever touch. They had become hope itself, walking the corridors of a place that had once been defined by fear, transforming it forever into a sanctuary where young women could learn and grow without the shadow of ancient evil darkening their dreams. The circle was broken in 1977, but it was also perfected, becoming not a chain of victims but a ring of guardians whose protection would last as long as the Academy itself stood. And in a world that often seemed dark and dangerous, that protection was perhaps the greatest gift 5 young women could have given to all the generations who would follow in their footsteps. Their bodies were never found because they had transcended the need for them. Their case was never solved because it had evolved beyond the understanding of conventional investigation. But their story lived on, whispered in dormitory rooms late at night, felt in moments of inexplicable safety and comfort, and embodied in the transformed spirit of an institution that had learned to honor life instead of feeding on it. The mystery of the 5 boarding school girls who vanished in 1977 was complete, not in its solution, but in its transformation into something eternal and beautiful. They had become the answer to every dark conspiracy, the light that shines in every shadowed corridor, and the proof that love, courage, and friendship can triumph over even the most ancient and terrible evil. And somewhere in the walls of Ravencrest Academy, 5 young women smiled, knowing that their story would continue forever, not as a tale of loss and tragedy, but as a legend of victory won through sacrifice, hope preserved through love, and darkness banished by the indomitable spirit of those who refuse to surrender to fear.